Welcome friends to today's full stack tutorial. We're going to work from the ground up and look at how we can build full stack applications with the Node.js, HTML, CSS, Firebase, and JavaScript stack. Now in this tutorial we're going to be building our server with Express. So here's a quick demo of the full stack project we're going to be building today. So we can type in a question: is this a great tutorial? We can type in the answers: yes, double, yes. We can add another option, triple yes. We can submit the poll, we get redirected to the poll site, and we can select an answer. Let's say we select triple yes, and we can see that now if we come into this application, it's all persisted using Cloud Firestore, and we can share this link with anyone and they will get access to the tutorial page, and they also have the ability to vote. We can come back home and generate a new poll, and yeah, it's just overall a great full stack application. And so to start this tutorial, we're first going to deconstruct full stack development and see what it actually means. And so every solid full stack project is comprised of three core parts. First, we have the front end, which is like the client or the client's computer. In the middle, we have a server. And in the back end, we have a database full of all the user information. And so in this project, we're going to have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on the front end. We're going to have a Node.js, an Express server, which is also in JavaScript. And finally, we're going to be using Firebase, or specifically Firestore, which is Google's noSQL database system. And so the way these three systems work together is the user loads the web page, so they send out a request from their computer to the server, and then we can send back HTML that is either server-side rendered or client-side rendered, and then the website will load on their computer. Now, they can send further requests to the server to retrieve or send information over. For example, in our application, we're going to be building a poll app. And so when a user clicks on a particular selection, we want to send that information to the server. Now, the server is kind of like the middleman, and we control the server, and it's our own private information, and we can define how it interacts with our database. And so the server can send information into the database and then further access it later. And so a full stack call might be the client sends a request to the server for a particular poll. We get that from the database, and then it's passed to the server, and then potentially server rendered or client side rendered on the client's application. And then hopefully they'll end up with a pretty poll that has a couple of questions that they can interact with. And so at this point you might be asking, why are we just using vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on the front end? And the answer to that question is sometimes you don't need a framework. Sometimes frameworks are overkill, and for a simple application like this, we're going to make it look beautiful just using these three right here. And so now that we've looked at the stack, let's dive into it. So the first thing we're going to do is open up our terminal and cd into the project directory that we want. And so I already have mine open, and we're going to make a directory, and I'm going to call mine poly, just like that. And now we're going to cd into poly, and we're going to run the command npm init to initialize a package.json file in our poly directory. Now this package.json file is great for managing dependencies and having start scripts, and it's essentially just going to allow us to run our Node.js application. And so now what we can do is open up our code editor, and we can see that we do in fact have that package.json file just here. And here we can see that we start off with nothing but a script. But if I open up a terminal in our code editor and install Express, which is the lightweight framework for our server that we'll be using, we can see that it's added to the dependencies object just here. And so now we can go ahead and add a start script, or in this case it's going to be a developer script, and we're just going to say nodemon server.js. And so that brings me to the second thing. Now what we're going to have to do is install a developer dependency, and we do that by adding these save developer flags, and we're going to be installing NodeMon. And so NodeMon will just restart our server whenever it recognizes a change in the server file. And so that is the third point, is that we're going to need a server.js file. And so just like that, we have our project structure. So we can go ahead and run npm run dev to run that developer script just there. And we can see that our server is running. And if I change it, it will in fact restart and run our console. So just like that, we have initialized some server code in Node.js. What do we do next? Well, the next thing that we're going to do is define our server. And so to do that, we're going to be using Express. And so we're going to have to require that Express package from our dependencies in our package.json file. And then we're going to have to define our app by calling Express as a function. So we're also going to make a port, which is going to be 8383. And we're going to use that port by telling our app to listen to requests at that localhost port. And we're also just going to say console.log server has started on port, and just pass it in as a template literal, just like that. And so now when we resave our code, we can see that our server has indeed started on port 8383, and we have a functioning Express server. So that's good and all. What on earth do we do with it? Well, that is an excellent question. And we can answer that question by coming into our browser and just going to that directory and seeing what we get. And in this case, we get absolutely nothing because we don't have any routes. And so we can see that when we come into our network tab and refresh this page, we send out a request to localhost 8383, and it is a GET request. And so we're going to have to come in here and define some routes using the HTTP verbs. And so the first example is going to be GET, and we're going to define it to that home route. And in here, we're going to say request and response, open that up, and we can res.send hi. And so now when we remake this request to this URL, it's going to be rerouted to this particular route within this port, and our server will respond by sending hi back. And so if I refresh that, we can see that we do in fact get hi on the page, and everything is working just the way we want it to. So we can make this even better though by adding a status just like that. And so a 200 status just lets the client or user know that their request was successful. So that's excellent. Now we have a working server with our first GET route. We're going to be having a few more routes. So some examples of the common verbs are get, post, put, and delete. But in our case, what we're going to want to do is actually serve up some server rendered HTML. And so we can do that by coming in here and defining some middleware, and we can say app.use express.static and call that method, and in here add public. And so what this is going to do is look for a public file and serve up any items we have in here. And so this is great for adding assets or maybe static images that you want hosted locally, or fonts. But in our case, we're going to define an index.html, and we're going to use an exclamation mark to get some boilerplate code. And in here, we can just say poly moly or hello, anything like that. And so now when I refresh this page, we can see that hello gets served up because it's the index.html file in our static folder. And so that is actually going to render this particular, only this home get route useless or redundant. And so for the minute, I'm going to change that to a post, and we can revisit that soon. So now that we have our first route working, we're serving up some server rendered HTML. It's just about time that we go ahead and style our app. And so we're going to start off by opening up a style tag in here and selecting the root element, and adding a box sizing of border box a padding of 0, and a margin of 0. And what that will do is currently we can see we have some additional padding and margin around the side. And so if I just save that and refresh this page, that is all gone. So that's the first thing. The second thing we're going to be doing is coming into Google Fonts. And we're going to be selecting Open Sans to make our application look infinitely better. And so you can just come in here and select all the different fonts that you want. And so I'm going to go for all of the non-italicized fonts, just like that. And so now we can copy these link tags and import this Google font by pasting that link into the head of our document. And so now that it's imported into our project, we can just copy this rule and size this over here and paste it into the root of our file. And now when I refresh this page, we'll see that the font changes to our Open Sans, which is just what we wanted. So that is looking pretty good. We now have our fonts imported. Let's start writing out some HTML. So in our document, we are going to need some forms. And so we're going to open up a form tag, and in here we're going to start off with an H1 that says holy moly. After that, we're going to have an input of type text, and we're going to make it required and give it an ID of question. So this is going to be where the user enters their question. We're also going to give it some placeholder text that says enter your question, ... I'll close that for the second, and now we can close that input. After that, we're going to have a label element, and inside of this label, we're going to have another input that is type text. And this is also going to be required. And this time we're going to give it a class of options and a placeholder of option 1. Now we'll close that, and then we're going to copy this whole element and duplicate it and just change that to say option 2. So now when I refresh my page, we can see that we have holy moly, we have 2 option fields, and that's pretty cool. And so just underneath that, we're going to need a div that has an ID of buttons. And in here, we're going to have a div with ID of the add button for the add button. And just beneath that, we're going to have an input of type equals submit. Now for this type being submit, we're also just going to have to add a value of poll. Close that. And the last thing we're going to do is use font awesome icons in this project. And so we can add them in by just saying font awesome CDN, coming up to this CDN.js and selecting this link tag just here. And then in our project, just like we did with the font sheet, we can copy and paste that in. And that will allow us to come over to font awesome icons and select some of their free icons. And so in here, I can just look up a plus, and we can copy that plus just like that and paste it in here. And now when I come back into our application refresh, we can see that that little plus shows up perfectly the way we want it. So now that we have most of our HTML in here, it's time to make our application look pretty. And so we have a few styles to apply, and we're going to begin with the body. So we're going to select the body tag and give it a display of flex, a flex direction of column. We're going to align items to the center, give it a minimum height of 100% view height, a background of 0f172a, and we're going to say color is white. So if I refresh the page, everything goes nice and dark, which is excellent. Next, we're going to select the form, and that is also going to have a display of flex and a flex direction of column, justify content in the center, align items also center. In this case, we're going to say a gap of 8 pixels between all the elements of the form, and a width of 90% of the view width, and a max width of 800 pixels. So that's looking pretty good. Now we have to start styling our H1. So we're going to have form H1, and so that's going to be the H1 at the top of the page. And in here we're going to say font weight of 800, letter spacing of 1.5 pixels to space out the letters. We're going to say color, hue, saturation, and lighting 180, 100%, and 80%. We're going to say text shadow 008 pixels, sky blue, text align center, user select none, and margin 32 pixels vertically and 0 horizontally. That didn't work the way I wanted it to. Margin. Refresh the page. Cool, that looks cute. Now onto the next thing. We've got some forms to style, some inputs I mean. So we're going to say form and select any direct child inputs. We're also going to select the form labels and the form label inputs. Except that should be just input. And in here we're going to say a width of 100% of the parent element, a background of transparent. We'll say an outline of none, so that when you select them you don't get these silly outlines. We're going to say a color, color of white, and a padding of let's say 6 pixels and 4 pixels. So just like that. So now if I refresh the page, we can see that that worked reasonably, although we still have these outlines. And that can be removed by adding a border of none. So now if I refresh that page, they're all gone, so that's cool. Expand this out, and it's still sticking to the side, but that is all right. And that is happening because I have a spelling error here just in the body. So if I refresh that, now that's centered. And so next we have the form div. And for this is also going to be a display of flex. No surprises there. Flex, we will be having a flex direction of column, a width of 100%, a gap of 5 pixels, align items center, and justify content center. Perfect. Cool, so that's the form div, which is this one here. Now we're going to select the form div, which is the divs inside, and specifically hover over it, and we're just going to say transform scale 1.25 so that it gets bigger. And so you can see that that just happens when we scale over that like that. And just ahead of that, we're going to say form div, and we're going to say color is going to be green, yellow. Cursor will be pointer, and width is going to be fit content. Just like that. So now we have a cute little green icon that we can click on. That's kind of neat. We can also just say transition duration of 300 milliseconds. And so what that will do is just slow that down a bit. Nice. Now we have the form div input, which is this style button just there. So we can select that. That is also going to be width of 100%, background of cyan, color black, nice dark text. We'll have a border of none. That's not what I wanted. Padding 8 pixels. Cursor will be pointer so that we know to select it. It's going to be a font. Have to add the thing. Font weight of 600. Font size 1.2 rem. And a margin of 18 pixels and auto. So let's see how that looks. Cool, so now we have these, looking good. We have this. That's excellent. Next, we're going to say form div input, and we're going to define some hover effects. And so that is going to just change the background to transparent and the color to cyan. So now when we hover over it, if I refresh this page, we can see that we get that cute little effect. Now, one thing we want to do is we added this transition duration here, but we actually want to come up into the body. And we just want to add it up here, and that is going to apply it to every single element in our document. And so that's just going to mean that they all automatically have this transition duration effect. Now let's just quick show it. So that's nice and responsive still, so that's good. Cool. And so after this, we're going to select the question by its ID. We're going to say border 1 pixel solid transparent. You'll see why in just a second. And now we're going to say border bottom is going to be 1 pixel solid aqua. So that will overwrite the color just like that, so that's nice. We're going to say margin of 4 pixels, 0, 12 pixels, and 0. So that's going to be top right, bottom left. Font size of 1.2 rem and a padding of 14 pixel, 12 pixel. Cool. Refresh that page. That's nice and big. Perfect. Next, we have the question for when we focus on it. So when a user is actually doing it, we're just going to say border 1 pixel solid aqua. So now when a user actually selects it, the whole thing pops up, which just looks super neat. And now we're going to say question and add a hover effect. That's just going to be opacity of 0.8 so that it gets a little bit darker. You hover over it, you get the impression you can select it. And then now I can move on to the options, which we can select the class using the period. So that's going to be options. And in here, we're going to have a position of relative, padding left of 20 pixels. It's going to be flex of 1. Color will be white. Border bottom is going to be 1 pixel solid transparent, and padding of 6 pixels and 3 pixels. Now I should just note that one of the reasons I add this transparent is because when you hover, if you suddenly add a border, it will add spacing to a particular element and it will kind of jump. Whereas if you preset it, it will know that it's going to expect some sort of border and like kind of reserve space for it, so it won't jump around. So now when I go dot options hover and set the border bottom to a different color, so I can say border bottom 1 pixel solid green yellow, it won't go recreating. And so we can see this. Now we get this nice little hover effect. But if I were to comment this out, we can see there's like a tiny jump behavior, which we don't want. And that's because it's creating that 1 pixel space every time. And finally, we have the form label, and that's just going to have a display of flex, align items center, and finally a gap of 10 pixels. So that is excellent. What do we do next? Well, now we dive into the JavaScript, and this is where it actually gets interesting. And so what we're going to do is add a script tag down here at the bottom of beneath our form, above our body. And the first thing we're going to do is select all of our labels by going document.query selector. I have to spell that right. Selector all, and we're going to select anything that fits the form, a label within a form. And so the first thing we're going to do is go labels.forEach label, and we're just going to say label.innerHTML is equal to, and we are going to come over to our font awesome icons and select the atom. select that class, and we're going to go backtick plus label.innerHTML. So that's just going to add whatever it currently is in there. And so now when I refresh that page and come over here, we can see that we get this nice little atom label sit in there. And that's just going to be our standard bullet point for all of our different options that we can put in. So the next thing we have to do is say const add button and select that. And so that's going to be document.getElementById. And in this case, we labeled it add. And we're going to add some functionality to this button. And so we can say const function add option, so add a new option. And in here, we're going to say const new node is equal to document.create element. And so this is going to make a new element, and we want it to be of type label. And so now what we need to do is select our form, and so that's going to be document.query selector. And since we only have one form, we can just select it like that. And so now down here, we can say form.insert before, and we can pass the new node, but the last thing we have to do is tell it where to insert it. And so we want to insert it just above this div here. So we're going to have to select that and just say const buttons is equal to document.getElementById, and just pass in that ID, which is buttons. And so now we can say, okay, insert this new node just before buttons, just like that. And now what we can do is say document.query selector, and we can select the last label. So we can say last of type, because this is the one we've just input. And we can say .innerHTML, and this is going to be equal to this, just like we had before. So we can paste that in plus an input of type equals text required class equals options, just like the rest of them above, and placeholder this time, however, is just going to be ... And so we can close that. And so now we can just assign this function to the add button by saying add button.add event listener, and it's going to be a click event. So on the click event, we can add that add option function. And so if I refresh this page, we can see that we can now add options that they can fill out for the different polls. Excellent. And so just like that, we are almost finished. The last thing we have to do is submit our document. So in here, we're going to define an asynchronous function, and we're just going to call it handle submit. And it's going to take an event, and the first thing we're going to do is do e.prevent default, just like that, because the standard default for a submit is to refresh the page, which we really don't want. So now what we can do is say console.log hello, and for the minute we're just going to test that this is working, but first what we have to do is actually assign it to that poll button. And so we can select this here by just giving an ID of equal to submit. And so we can just say const submit button is equal to document.getElementById submit. And finally, we can just say submit button.add event listener submit. On the submit event, we can handle submit. And so if we just try that out, refresh that page, we can see that nothing's happening. And so what I think is the issue is if we just rename this func submit, I think handle submit is a bad term. And what we can actually do is instead just say action equals to nothing and add the on submit here. And we can just say func submit and call that as a function. We can just pass it this. And so now in here, if I refresh this page, we can see that e.prevent default is not a function, so let's just comment that out. Refresh that once more. And so now we can see that we do indeed get hello working, and that is our form all done. If I try submit the poll, it still asks us to fill everything out, and so we can just go ahead and remove that line just there. So that's our first page done. The next thing we need to do is set up some routes to receive all of this information that we're going to be posting. And we can do that pretty easily in our server.js file, but the first thing we have to do is tell it that it's going to be expecting some JSON information. And so now that we've told it to expect some JSON information, we can come into this post route, because we'll be using a post request to send the information, and we can destructure. We can say const, in this particular case we'll need an ID, we'll need a question and some options from that, and so we can say request.body. And in this particular case, what we could do now is just say console.log ID, question, and options. So if we come back in here, let's go ahead and submit all of that information. And so what we will need to do is say const question is equal to document.getElementById. And we need to select the question because we gave it the ID and get the value from that input form. We're going to say const options is equal to array.from document.query selector all, and we're going to select every .options class. And once we have that, we're going to map over each option and return option.value. So that will take the inner text value and return it. And so we'll have an array of all of the options. And now what we can do is just say const ID is equal to math.floor math.random times 10,000, for example. So that will just randomize an ID. And so now we can say const res is equal to await, which is why we need that async keyword, fetch. We're posting it to the home route, so we just leave that route like that. Now in here we have a method, and the method is post. We have to define some headers, which is going to be content type is going to be application/JSON. And finally, we define the body of the request, which is going to be ID, question, and options. And so if I'm correct, that should be just about everything we need to actually post that request. So now if I come back and make this page and just say, what's your favorite color, blue or yellow, and submit that poll, we get a bad request, unexpected token, and that is actually just because I forgot something major. We have to JSON.stringify this body request. So it has to be passed as JSON. We can't send an actual object. What is your favorite color? James and blue. Send that request, and we can check out our network tab and see that that did indeed get sent. The payload is all there, so that's perfect. We've got all of our options and the question, and we received it on the backend with a random ID. However, what we did not do in our server is define a response. And so we could just say res.status200.send, and we could just say, well, actually in this particular case you don't have to send anything. You could just say send status 200. So that will count as a response, and so we send that again and we can see that we get back a response that's just okay. So cool, that's all of our posting system. The next thing we're going to do is just implement a small JSON database. And so for that, I'm going to define a JSON.database file and have db functions. Now the link to this code is in the description below, but we're just going to copy and paste it straight in, just like that. So there's your snapshot. And essentially what this does is it gives us two functions, read database and write database. So we initialize the database as an empty object. And in our main app, we can say const read db write db is equal to require, and just require in that database functions file. And so now when a user comes through with an ID or a question or an options, we can actually go ahead and persist that information in a JSON database, which we'll just do in lieu of using Firebase a bit later. And so we can just say const current polls is equal to read database. And so that will just read in the JSON file. And then what we can do is write the database, spread the current polls, and just add on the ID. Open that up as an object. And in here, we can just have the question. And for the options, what we're going to do is do options.reduce, because currently it's an array of each option. But we're going to use a reduce function, which takes an accumulator and a current value and actually return an object, because we need to persist how many people have selected that option. And so in here, we're just going to return and spread the accumulator and we'll use the option as a key and just return 0 as the initial value, just like that. And so the last thing we do is up here, if nothing comes through from any of this information, so if, for example, not ID or not question or not options, well, actually even better, we can just say options.length equals 0, we can just res.status 400 error.send, and we're just going to send a status of error. So if they don't send the relevant information, then they're just going to get an error status back. Otherwise, that will all be persisted in our database. And so we can test that by just going, what is your favorite color, question mark, blue, green, submit this poll. And now we can actually look at our JSON database, and it has an ID. It's saved our question and our options. And so we can start using that in our second file in just a moment. The last thing I'm just going to do is define a second route, app.get. And this is just going to be IDs. And in here, what we're going to do is just read the database. So we're going to say const IDs is equal to, and we're going to read the database, and we're just going to say res.status200.send, and we're going to send an IDs object, which is just object.keys IDs. And so essentially what that's going to do is just send through an array of all of the IDs just to make sure that we don't have any overwriting IDs. And so here what we're going to do is just have a secondary request. So we're going to say const IDs res is equal to await fetch, and it's going to be to IDs, just like that. And so the default is a get request, and so now we can say const destructure IDs from await res ID res dot JSON, just like that. And so in here, what we can do is define the ID a little lower and just say IDs, which is an array, dot length equals 0, question mark, then the ID will just be 1. Otherwise, what we're going to do is go math.max, spread the current IDs array, and just add 1 to it. So now we should have always a totally unique ID. And so we can just test this once more by refreshing this page. Who is James? Question mark. A man. A monster. So if we poll that, we can see that that has worked. And now if we check out our database, that didn't work. It has to be res.json like that. That was my mistake. So let's do that again. Who is James, our man, monster? Poll that. That runs. We can see that we get the second question coming through. And now if we look at our database, we have 2 questions. And the second one is just 1 increment bigger than the next. So that is excellent. That's all working. I'm just going to reset that to an empty database so we have no questions. And now what we're going to do is define a new route down here. And that is going to be to serve up our poll file. So if we're receiving the URL for a poll. And so we do that by saying app.get. And in this case, we're going to have a dynamic ID, just like that. Request, response, open that up. And the first thing we're going to do is destructure that ID from the request.parameters. Now in here we could console.log it just to have a look at it. And we're going to use a try catch block, so we'll catch the error, to send a different file. And in this particular case, we're going to make a new file, and that's just going to be poll.html. Now, this file will not be automatically sent, and so in this particular case, what we have to do is return res.status 200, so successful status, and now we send a file, and we have that file called poll.html. However, the last thing you have to do is define a root, and that's going to be _directory name +/public. So that just tells the server where to find that file. And if we get a response, we can console.log the error, and we can res.status 500 server error.send, and just send something that says status. Well, actually, even better, we could just, once again, res.send status 500, just like that, magic. And so now if I come in here and add 1, 2, 3, 4, we can see that we render a totally blank HTML file. But if I were to change this to say James and save that, we get James showing up just like that. So that is all good. Now, what do we do in this file? Well, the first thing we're going to do is come back into our index.html, and we are going to steal a few of these styles. And so we're going to copy everything from the Google font to the bottom of this root selector, and we're going to come into our poll and paste that right there, closing that style tag. And so now when I refresh that page, we can see that everything has vanished, but we did in fact get that ID showing up. But the content is empty, so if I just change that to James and refresh that page, we get James up on the top, just how we would expect it. And so now we have to style this page, and we are going to start off by selecting the body. And we're once again going to set the min height to 100% of the view height. The background is going to be #01. Let's just see what it was in here. Well, actually, a lot of this is just going to be similar, so we may as well just copy the whole thing. Just like that. Same body, and now we can refresh the page, and that is all nice and dark. Where does James keep going? How does that keep vanishing away? Refresh that. And in here, we're not actually going to have a lot of content. We're just going to have an H1, and then we're going to have an unordered list with the ID of options, because a lot of this is going to be client-side rendered, as much as this first page was mostly static. Well, completely server-side rendered. Now, to make this all work, we're going to have to open up a script down here, and this page is going to be entirely dependent on this ID. So the first thing we're going to do is say const ID is equal to window.location.pathname.replace all slash that. And so what that is going to do is if we console.log ID, that is just going to read that parameter from the URL so that we can get the ID of the page they're on. And so the first thing we're going to do is make the same request that we made in this other file just over here. So this one, just here, this ID's request, so we can copy these two lines because we're going to have to quickly check if it's a valid ID. So we're going to say async function check if valid, and just run those two in here. And if IDs dot includes ID, not though, then what we're going to do is say window.location.href is equal to the home location. And so in this particular case, it's going to be super annoying because I'm going to refresh the page. And it looks like I am, in fact, getting something back, which I shouldn't be. And that's because I haven't called the function. So now we have to check if valid, call that function. So when I refresh this page, window is not defined, and that's because it's window. And now we can see it immediately redirects us back to that first page. So that's all good. If I were just to come into the JSON and just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and just have whatever, and go 1, 2, 3, 4, you will see that now it allows us to sit on this empty page. However, we actually don't want to do that because we want to have some valid content in here. So I'm just going to erase that. We're going to say, what is your favorite dinosaur? Question, your mum, James, and we'll add 2 more items. God and the pterodactyl. Submit that poll. Now that poll has worked. That's all good. It's refreshed that page. Later down here, we'll also have to just come back and make sure that we redirect to that page. And so I might actually do that right now. So after we make that fetch request, we're just going to say window.location.href equals /JavaScript template literals. So we're going to go to ID, just like that. So we make that, but anyway, we can come into our database function, see that it's number 1. So we can come over to ID number 1, empty page, and now in here it's going to let us stay on this page. That is absolutely perfect. So we've checked if the page is valid, and so we can actually go a step further and just say on load, because this function is actually going to get called to render all the information that we need on the page. So the first thing we're going to have to do from this file is just say const question is equal to document.query selector, and we're just going to select, in this particular case, I actually forgot something. We're going to change that to main, put both those items inside of main, because this selector we want to be main with the direct descendant of the h1. And we're also going to select options is equal to document.query selector, and we're just going to select the unordered list. So now that we've selected both of those options, down here, what we're first going to have to do is make a secondary request. So we're going to say const res is equal to await fetch, and that is going to be /data plus ID. And now what we're going to do is destructure data from that and just say await res.json. Now we'll need to define this route on the backend, and so if we come into our server, we're going to make one just down here that is app.get /data / and give it the dynamic ID. And so now it's going to be request response. And in this particular case, we're once again going to destructure ID from the request.parameters. However, next what we're going to do is say const data is equal to read database, get the ID, and then we're going to res.status status 200.send, and we're just going to send an object with the key data, and that will actually make both parameters. And so now in poll we should get this data back by just saying console.log data, and that should contain the question and everything else. And so we can actually just say question.inner text is equal to data.question, it should be. And we're going to add one more thing on that. We're just going to make sure that if their questions don't have a question mark, we're going to add a question mark. And so for that, we're just going to add in a plus data.question.includes a question mark. If it's true, we're just going to return an empty string. Otherwise, we're going to add a question mark onto the end of it. And so now when I refresh the page, we can see that we do in fact get that popping up with the question mark. We get the question and all of the options. And so the next thing that we can do is just say let new inner list text, or actually HTML, equal to an empty string. And we can go object.keys data.options, because it's a key, it's an object, and map over each of them. Well, actually even better, we'll use a for each loop, and we're going to take the option and the index, and for each of them we're going to say new inner list HTML plus equals, so add on to it a list item, just like that, except it's going to have some properties. So the first one is going to be the ID, which is going to be equal to the index, so that we can always select it later. And in here, we're going to render out the actual option. So finally, after we've made that, we have to say options. Oh, looks like I've forgotten to close something. That's going to be options, and I'm actually going to change this to say options list. It's going to be option list dot inner HTML is equal to new inner list HTML. And so if we go ahead and rerun this page, we can see that we get a list of all the little options showing up just as you would hope that we might. So that is super cute. What do we do next? Well, I think that we should probably style this page too. And so we will do exactly that. And so the first thing we're going to do is select the main. It's going to have a max width of 800 pixels. We're going to give it a margin of 0 vertically and auto horizontally so that it self-centers. A display, you guessed it, flex, flex direction, column, justify content, center, align items, center, and a gap of 20 pixels. Cool, so that's main. Next, we're going to select the h1 tag, so main, the direct descendant h1 tag. And so that's going to have a font weight of 800. But in this particular case, we're going to do something slightly different. And we're just going to say dash webkit dash text dash stroke is equal to 1 pixel cyan. And we're going to say dash webkit dash text dash fill color is transparent. And so if we refresh the page, we can see that we get this funky outline text, which is kind of cool. What I'm also just going to do is make that 1.5 pixels. So it's a bit thicker. We're also going to have a text align of center, user select of none, a margin of 32 pixels and 0, text transform everything into uppercase, and a border bottom of 1 pixel solid cyan. So just like that. So let's refresh that page. So that looks kind of fun. I might actually just change this to be color cyan and text shadow 00, 8 pixels sky blue maybe. Refresh that. Except I might bring this down to 4 pixels instead. What is your favorite dinosaur? Yeah, that looks kind of fun. Okay, so that's the question. And now for the polls, what we're going to do is have a ULLI text transform. We want to capitalize the options. We're going to say a list style of none. We're going to have a user select of none. We're going to have a cursor pointer so that they want to click on it. We're going to have a width of 100%, a border of 1 pixel solid transparent. We're going to have a padding of 8 pixels, 8 pixels, so just 8 pixels. So let's see how that looks. Spread them out a little bit. We want to hover on them. That's cool. And now we're just going to have ULLI and add some hover effects. So that's just going to be color green, yellow. Background is going to be black. And border left is going to be 1 pixel solid green, yellow. Just like that. So now when you hover over them, they're going to show up like that. Now, somewhere in here, we should have a bit more width. And that is because I'm actually missing one last thing. So we have to target the options section. And we're just going to say display of flex direction column, a gap of 8 pixels, and a width of 100%. So now when I refresh that, we can see that these show up a bit better, and we can actually, want to click on a particular item. So that's kind of neat. I might also just add in that little icon that we used in the other one, which was kind of fun. So in here, we could just select this little icon just here, just like that. Come into our poll and literally just paste it on the inside just like that. So let's see how that looks. Refresh that page. And so the last thing we'll have to do is just come in here and just say ULLI, and we'll just give it a padding of 0 and perhaps 3 pixels right, 0, 0, just like that. So now if we save and refresh that, just puts a bit of space. We could even make this maybe like 6 pixels. Cool, that's kind of fun. You could even add a hover effect and just say, just here we could go ULLI hover. Actually, no, let's not worry about that. That looks pretty good for now. Cool, so here we have all of our options. Now what we're going to want to do is allow the user to click on one and actually show up some poll details. And so what we're going to do is define a function, and that's just going to be called let's say man clicky, or actually let's be better, people click. And in this particular case, we're going to apply it to every single one. And so since they all have the ID of their index, we should actually be able to see which one is being clicked on. And so in this particular case, we're just going to console.log. And I believe if we have an event here, we should be able to see which one has been clicked on. Actually, no, even better. So this will receive an index, and we can console.log that index. And so what we're going to do here is say options list dot is equal to options ally is equal to document dot query select all, and we're going to select every list element. And now what we're going to do is say options to ally for each, select an option, and let's just start off by console.log. Nice. Okay, so that didn't work for us, and I believe what is happening is we have to add this logic in after we have created this list, so just in here. So now when we run that, we can see we get 4 nices, which is perfect. And so what we can do is we can just open this up onto a new line and say option.add event listener on click, and that can just be people click, just like that. So now let's see what that does for us. We get hi, hi, hi. Let's see what index returns back. Okay, so we get a pointer event, path, source element is a list with ID 1. So I believe if we click on this last one, it will say source with list 2. So that is absolutely excellent. The one change we could possibly make is actually just change this ID to the option. But if we do that, we have to ensure that the option is unique, and we can do that in here by just saying we can put this inside of an array and spread it and just write new set and select all of that. And what that will do, actually we can just go like that, is make sure that every term is unique from the options, because there's no point in doubling them up. So in here, all of these options will guarantee be unique. So that is all hunky-dory. And so now when I refresh this page and I click on a particular element, we can see that the God was obviously selected. And so now when I click on pterodactyl, we should see that pterodactyl, and then when your mom was selected, we can see that it's your mom. So that is super cool. And so what that basically means is that we can submit that click event and display all of the data. So when this gets called, what we're going to do is switch out these names and these styles for some, well, essentially a graph of all the different options. And so currently they all have a background, but what we're going to do is change that slightly. But first we're going to have to calculate the maximum value from all of them. So we're going to say const max number of votes is equal to object dot values, and I believe that is received as where is it? So we get this in here. So what I'm going to have to do is assign this to something here. So we'll just say const, how do we want to do this? So we'll just say let options from server equal an empty array. And so when we actually get them, just in here, data.options, we're just going to say options from server is equal to data.options, just so that they are persisted. So that should do the trick there. And that means that down here, we should be able to get that data from options. So we can say data from, options from server. And so that will return all of the values. And will that work? Actually, sure, that will be an array of all of the values. And so for each value, so we could be able to say for each, and just say val, and for the second we could just console.log val. Why don't we just see if that works? Console.log val. So if I come back here and refresh this page, when we click, we can see that we get 0 back 4 times. So that's absolutely perfect, because currently there are 0 votes on this entire thing. So that's working nicely. So that is an array of values. And so what we can do is just say math.max and spread that array. And so that would just return the maximum number of votes. So that's cool. So now that we have the max number of votes, we're going to have to go through each item and apply a standard width and some background styling. And so that shouldn't be too hard. We're also going to have to disable the click event because they will have voted. So we are going to target, here we set them, so we have all of these being created. So we have all of these option lists. And so we can just do the same thing. Option list. So we can define it here. Const option list is query selector all list. And so in this particular case, I could just say options list dot for each val. And in this case, I'll just console.log. Let's just make sure it's working. So if I come back here, refresh the page, your mum, we can see that we get 4 working. So that's working nicely. So for each of them, we're going to want to open this up and change the background to something in particular. We're also going to want to remove the event listener for the click. So it's going to be option, well, in this case, val.remove event listener. And that will be click and people click. And then we can set the background by just saying val.style.background is equal to a particular string. And so what I'm going to do here is define some linear gradients. So I'm just going to have const linear gradients that I like is equal to, and so in this particular case, it would just be linear gradient to right, and then I'll just include the rest of the string like that and close that. And so in here, this will be this to this is going to be the first one, and then we're going to have this color to this color, and then we'll have this color to this color, and then maybe just one more. Let's go with something quite bright. So that did not work, so it's FDFC 47, comma, hashtag 24FE 41. Okay, cool. And so then we have in here the ability to just say linear gradients, and we're just going to say math.floor math.random times by linear gradients.length. And that should randomly assign a particular linear gradient to each of them. So let's just see if that works. And it totally does. It looks absolutely atrocious, but you know, that's all good. Random sequence. Totally bizarre. Now in this particular case, for each list item, what we're going to do is actually change them to dark linear gradients because it's hard to see the text. Well, actually, no, even better, what we could do is just change the text color to be that particular style. So we could just say val.style.color is equal to hashtag, and we can just do whatever we set up here, which is this one just here. So that will make it a dark color. So let's do that once more, click on it, and they will become dark. Cool. Now the other thing we want to do is set them according to their maximum widths. So we're going to say if max, where do we define maximum width? Maybe we didn't. Maximum number of votes is just there. So if maximum number of votes is equal to 0, then in here what we're going to do is just say well, actually, we're only going to do it if it's not equal to 0. So if max number of votes is not equal to 0, why am I doing like that? That's silly. Not equal to 0, then we're going to change the widths of each of them. So in this particular case, the val.style.width is going to be equal to, and this is going to be a calculation in percentage. So it's going to be the number of votes for this particular element divided by the max number of votes as a percentage. And so we can just do that by, how do we do that? Okay, so in here we have to get into the index, so we can just select, okay, so we have to do some image processing. So we could do it from path. We don't necessarily need path. Let's go target. Okay, so it's going to be the pointer events, so index.target dot split, and we're going to split on the hash, and we're going to select the second element, just like that. So now in here, if I just say 1 divided by max number of votes, refresh the page, let's see if our console.log, okay, index.target is .split is, oh, sorry, it's not toString.split. Let's see if that works better. Undefined, well, that's not what I wanted. Okay, so index.target. What does that give back? I click on it, I get this style, I get that whole element. Okay, .id. Oh, well, that actually worked really nicely. Look at that, we can just do that. So in here, const option is equal to index.target.id. And so now what I can do is just come up here, and wherever I set options from server, I can just go options.server and reference the option, and that should actually just return the value. And so if the one last thing that we have to consider is we're just going to say if this value is equal to 0, then we're just going to return 0, because if we divide by 0, that's going to be a nightmare. So equals 0 question mark, then maybe we just return like 5% minimum. Otherwise, we'll do that. So refresh that, get some random linear gradients. Equally, there's actually a better way we can apply the linear gradients in just a second. And so now if I were to come back into the database.json and change this to 5, 1, we can leave that as 0, and 10, and refresh the page and click on it, we can see that that absolutely did not work at all. And let's go find out why. So it looks like it set them all to 5%. So for some reason, this little if check, wherever it might be, isn't working properly. So options.value is equal to 0. Options from server. Well, why don't we just console.log that value? Console.log options from server option. Let's see what that gives us. Click on that. We get 4 1s. So what happens if I just console.log option? Refresh that. I see. So what it's doing is it's actually just selecting that 5 times. So that's silly. So in this particular case, what we want to do is, this is all working correctly, but we want to do something different with this option. So in this, we're just going to send this off to server and increment it here. But instead, what we want to do is for option list.each, we actually want to get the option in here. So this is just going to be val.target.id. So when I refresh this, we can't get the ID, so we can console.log the value. Let's have a look at what that gives back. So that gives it just like this. So we don't need the target, we can just go val.id. So we'll just say const selected is equal to index.target.id. So that's cool. And in here we'll just target this ID. And we want to set the width equal to the option. Yeah, so let's try that once more. So we click on this and we can see we get these random little options. Now, unfortunately, it is dividing by, it's setting them as a percentage, and so what we have to do is then finally multiply this by 100 times by 100. And we can see we get the votes back. So the pterodactyl is by far the most popular, and that is excellent. So the last thing we might want to do is just, if whatever one is here, then we want to obviously add it. So whatever they voted for. And we will also send this off to the server. So we're going to have to make this an asynchronous function call. So in here, we will just say if selected is equal to val, so if selected equals val, then what we want to do is some logic, otherwise we'll have an else block just in here with all of this. So the minimum width is fine, and what we would do here is just say +1 vote, and we can put that in parentheses. So if it's equal to, then it's done, so James gets an extra vote. If we go for pterodactyl or like mum, we'll see that that's about half. Let's just make it super obvious. If I add 100, that didn't work. Oh, sorry, it's actually not val, it's meant to be option. So now when I add it, we can see that it's just infinitely large. Ridiculous. So we're just going to add 1. That works nice. That's absolutely perfect. And the other thing we're going to do is, instead of having these linear gradients in here, we're going to come up to here and just say dot lins nth child 3n, just like that. And we're going to say linear background is linear gradient, and we're going to just copy this straight from there. Pop that in there like that. So we'll say to right. Cool. And then we're going to copy this twice and just say 3n plus 1 and 3n plus 2. And so now if we just select some of these other gradients, so for example, maybe we take, that last one was atrocious, so we'll not be using that one. We'll copy that. Copy that. So that is the pretty purple one. And then this one is orange. And so instead what this will do is just apply it in a sequential order. And so now we can delete this. And we can, instead of applying the styles, so just where we have here, we can add a class list instead. So we can just say val.classList.add, and we can just pop on .lins, just like that. So now when I refresh the page, we get a repeating little graph that looks kind of cute. The only issue is going to be that if the text is like that, so what we might just want to do is come up here and say min width is fit content. So it just has to fit the content anyway. So it's not going to be 100% accurate for these smaller values, but at least it'll work for the most part. So that's looking super cool. I might just make sure that that icon always stays a certain color. And we can just do that by saying color white and adding the important flag. So now it just always remains white. And then finally, what we will do is send this off to our database so that it can be added to the click. And so I will remove this. So we have the selected, we have that for each logic. So I'll just split them up a little bit. And down here, we're just going to say send result to server. So we're just going to say const res is equal to await fetch, and that is going to be sent to a server route that we just have to define real quick. So we're going to call that app.post/vote, and we will request response that, and in here we're just going to say const ID and vote is equal to request.body, because we'll send it in the body. And what we can do is just say const data is equal to readdb. We can say const, we can just edit it directly, so we can say const ID and the vote, and we can just plus equal 1 to the count, and then we can say write db is equal to data, just like that. And so that should actually persist that information. So now we just have to send it. So we send it to vote. We open that up. So the method is going to be post. And in here we're going to have headers. Open that up. So content type is application/JSON. And then finally the body is going to be json.stringify. We're going to open this up and we're going to have the ID, which we have from the top of the page. So that is all good. And then finally, we're going to have to set the selected value, which is just going to be selected. But instead, we're going to call that vote. Vote is equal to selected. And so now if I refresh this, let's just check the current values. So currently your mum is 5. These are all of our values. So let's say I vote for your mum. That failed to send. Why did that fail to send? Server, vote, post. What happened? Let's check the database. Okay, so that didn't work. Did we send a response back? We didn't send a response back, so we have to res.send status 200. Just like that. So let's try that once more. Uncaught. Failed to fetch. People element. So let's just double check the information that is coming through on this end. So in here we're going to console.log ID and vote. Refresh that. Click on that. So we can see it gets 1 in your mum. So in here we access, that's right, options. So we have to select. So it has been incrementing your mum, which it shouldn't have done. So I'll just remove that. And so we just have to make sure that we select options within there. So that's just going to be options. Just like that. Okay, perfect. So now when we select your mum and then refresh the page and keep refreshing, it's catching up. Maybe we want God to have some more. Looks nice and neat and responsive. We could possibly add some padding around the entire page, but in fact we may as well just do exactly that. So let's just come up here. Here we have the bottom. We're just going to say padding of 4 pixels. Refresh that. but we also have to make sure that we set a maximum width of whatever that needs to be on these list items. So the list is 100%. And instead, why don't we just set a maximum width on these list items? Max width 100% of the parent element. And let's just make sure that is extra important. Refresh, vote. Okay, cool. That seems to do the trick nicely. Can't tell if your mom is getting further or further. Oh, well, that's right, because we're reaching the minimum content allowable. But now if we come back into the database, we should be able to see that mum is winning by far 24, pterodactyl at 13. And so if I made that 244, refresh the page, we can see that pterodactyl only just fits. Cool, and so the last thing we could possibly do is just increase that padding around the entire page to maybe make it like 8 pixels, just so it fits a bit more snug. What is your favorite dinosaur? Your mum looks super good. And then the last thing we want to do is just have a button down the bottom that says home. So body is flex, and main we're going to say is just flex of 1, so it occupies a lot of room. And then underneath of that main element, we're just going to add a footer, and the footer is going to have a little home icon on it. So if we just come in here, we can just look for home, select this little house, copy that, paste it into the footer, and we can just select the footer in here and just say display is grid, place items, center, and we can say footer hover, just like that, and maybe make it a color of green yellow. Why don't we do that? Okay, let's see how that looks. So we'll refresh the page. Actually, and let's just remove that line there. Nope, that was the wrong one. Remove that line. That's at the top. The home sits down the bottom. Perfect. Come out, hover over it. It turns green, and we might just add a little cursor pointer onto it. So just here we'll say cursor pointer. And what we'll do is for this footer element, we could actually change it to just be an A tag, an anchor tag like that. And so when they click on it, it will route them home. And so let's just refresh that page. And so when they click on it, we can add an href equals slash, just like that. So now if we refresh the page, we also just want to remove some of the styling. So we'll have to just say anchor, text decoration, none, color inherit. And that should just about do it. We click on the home, and now you can enter your own poll. And so we could say, what is the, how many people are on Earth? 4, 8, 10. Poll, we need to redirect to that page. So that's the next thing we have to do. So after we do this, window.href, so that did not redirect very well. So let's just console.log, whatever that may be. We got options.reduce is not a function. Where did that happen? Options.reduce, so it must have been in poll. Server.js, so options.reduce, it seemed to have an issue here. Options, options, options. So we should have consoled. Nothing came through, it appears. Options. I see, so this did not work. So what I will do for the second is just get rid of that. So this is how it used to be. And I know exactly what the issue was. And so in here we can just say const unique options is equal to ... new set options, just like that. That was my incorrect syntax. And so here we can just pass it like that. And so now when I say, what is your favorite color? We can say, and let's just test out that question mark theory, blue, green, purple, poll. That comes up, we can click on blue, and then when we refresh the page, it's a different vote. Cool. The last step is to now switch out our JSON database for a Firebase database, so that the data is forever persisted. And so now that that is all working well, we're actually just going to make a couple of small changes. And the first one is to this response dot here, so this post request. So if we come into the server and look for our .post, here we send res.status, whereas in reality we're actually going to say res.redirect, and we are going to send the redirection URL to / plus the ID in question. And the reason we're going to do that is because currently when we submit this form, we redirect to that page before it's necessarily been written to the database. And so that can just end up with some buggy behavior. However, if we switch it over to this and come into our index.html file, now what we can do is say if res.redirected is true, then we can do window location URL is equal to res.url, because the URL will come through with the redirected route. And so now we can make a new poll, refresh this page, and just say James, Henry, Lucy, poll. Now we notice that our server is also restarting, and that's because our database.json file and our nodemon is picking that up. But we can just add the .ignore flag to our nodemon, and we can just say .json, anything with a JSON file, just like that. And so now when we can be more specific, we could just say db.json. So if I refresh that page, random question, poll, we can see that it works perfectly. Let's just try that once more just to make extra sure. Refresh the page. Who is cooler? James, Bernie, poll. It still refreshes it. Why does it do that? And so one of the reasons the page keeps refreshing and not always working is because down here we just want to add a return statement, and up here when we receive event we want to say e.prevent default, which the default for the event is to refresh the page. And then finally up in our form we just want to pass the event into this particular function just here. So just like that. And so now if I refresh this poll and say James is cool and poll, we can see it works perfectly every time. And so now we can select one of these options just like that, and that will continue to get larger and larger. So that is almost this page. We're actually just going to make one other minor change to this page just here, and it's going to regard this div with the ID of buttons. And so in here, this is going to be selected by form div. So just here. And what we want is to justify the content space between and give it a flex of 1. We also just have to add that in there so that it only selects that first div. And we also just want to make sure that the form has a flex of 1 so that it default knows to take up the entire page. And so now we can just see that that's going to push this poll button to the bottom. But if I add a whole lot of these, then it will just continue to scroll down and it will stay down there. So that's just this page. So that's going to split that up. Now if we enter a question, favorite fruit, and let's say we have banana and apple, and we click poll, the other thing we're going to want to do is make sure that these occupy the right amount of width, and it looks like they do. So here we have apple and banana. Yep, that's all good. And so now in our poll form, we're also just going to want to have a link where people can actually select this URL and send it to their friends. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to say, here we get the whole path name, but what we're actually going to say is const current URL is equal to window.location.url. And now we're just going to put in a div. Here we have the footer, and we may just add it in a little div here, and we'll give this an ID of URL. And so now what we can do is say const URL div is equal to document.getElement by ID URL, and we can say URL div dot inner text is equal to the current URL. And we can also apply some styles to this div just here, so we can select it just up here and say URL, and we could just give it a background of you could even give it white, a text, a color, sorry, of green, yellow, and a text align center. So if I refresh the page, we can see that that shows up down there, and we're currently getting undefined, and that's because I think that has to be href. So if I refresh this page and save this document, we get the actual form. And so we're also just going to want to give this some padding of maybe 2 pixels vertically and 4 pixels horizontally. We'll give it a margin of 4 pixels vertically and auto horizontally. So if I refresh the page, it makes it a bit bigger. And now what I might actually just do is remove the background of white, and then it's just going to be this. And so this is going to be the URL that they can share from. We might also just make the font size a tiny bit smaller, so we could go 0.8 rem. Refresh that, it's just a little smaller. And so now everyone can share this link with their friends if they just copy that. And send it to anyone that they like. So now we can select banana and load it. Now the one other thing that we're going to note is we just want to change the way this section works. So if the max number of votes is not equal to 0, if it is equal to 0, then what we want to do is still set the 5% width to everything. So we're still going to do this, copy this if block here. Let's think about this for a second. Yep, so we'll have this code in here. If the selected option is equal to option, and so now when I do it and I refresh this page, actually let's go home and make a new poll. So we'll just go random number. We'll go 8 and 3, those are my favorite numbers. Poll. We click on 8, both of them go to the min, and that's because what we want to do is selected is equal to option. Max number of votes should both be 0, so that should be, and here we can just change this, and so this is just going to be 100%. So if it is equal to, if selected is equal to the option, then we just want to set the width to 100%. So width is going to be 100% simply. So let's try that with one more. Random fruit, question mark, James, apple. We don't want to save that. Poll. We get absolutely nothing. Random fruit, there you go, it loaded. Click on that, we get 100, and it immediately works the way that it would. So cool, that's our random fruit, and we can continue to select them. Then they're equal. Now the apple takes over. Until it can't. Excellent. And so now we have this working poll. And so the last thing that we need to do is hook up Firestore so all of this information is permanently persisted. And the way that we can do that is by coming over to Firestore, Cloud Firestore, we will go to the console. We'll have to log in. And so once we're in here, we're going to add a project. We'll just call this Poly. Just like that. Continue Google Analytics. We don't need them. We'll create that project. We'll wait for that to run and load. We'll continue. We come into our project. What we want to do is go into Firestore. And once we're in here, we'll need to create a database. We can just start in test mode. Click Next. Set the default location, which can just be whatever is closest to you. Enable that. It will provision that database for us. And so now that we're in here, we have all of this stuff where you can monitor your usage, rules, and indexes. We don't have to worry about it too much. And so now we're going to start a collection. We're just going to call it polls. We'll click Next. We'll give it an auto. We will identify it. So polls. Just here, and then we can save that. And then in here, we'll populate this field with all of our different polls. And so to configure Firebase with Node.js, we're just going to come to this documentation page here. And you can see that I have selected Node.js in the development environment. And so we're just going to follow through these instructions. The link to this instruction sheet will be in the description below. So we're just going to npm install firebase.save. We'll scroll down. And so now what we're going to do is create a new file called firebase.javascript. And in here, we're just going to copy in both these lines. So we can just copy that directly. We will copy all of this. Initialize app. And then we are just initializing on our own server, actually. So what we're going to do is switch that out for this. We still need the timestamp and field value. Yep, that's perfect. And so this code for credentials, we're going to have to cert and get a service account. And the way that we do that is by coming into our Poly application, and we want to go into project settings, and we need to set up a service account just like this. And so now we have to generate a new private key. So we will generate this key. You want to save it to a download file, so we'll save that. And now this information, you'll want to copy it into your project folder. So if we just show in Finder, and so now you can see I've just dragged it into my project directory just here. And so now that we have it in here, I'm just going to rename it to polycreds. And we can just read this into here by literally just saying /polycreds.json. And so now that will initialize our app, and we can just say export default database just like that. And in our main application, we can just say const db is equal to require./firebase. And so just like that, we have Firebase initialized in our project. And so we can check that by saying npm run dev. And we can see that we get an error, and that's actually because we have to switch this to module.exports is equal to db, because it's a modular file. And so now when we import it into our server, we'll just have to import it like such. And so here we could console.log db, and you can see that we get this whole database field. And so that's going to allow us to switch out some of this posting logic and instead write to our database. And the way that we do that is fairly straightforward. We can once again come to their documentation and just look at how they add data. And so all you have to do is say const docref is equal to collection and the specific document. So in here we would just say they post this information. We're going to say const docref is equal to collection. Our collection name, if we look at Firestore, is polls. And our doc is also called polls. And so the next step is we just set information here like that. And so now that we have the document ref, what we're going to want to do is say const response is equal to, and we're just going to have to quickly change this to async. So it's going to be await docref.set, open that up in a bracket, and here we're going to add the new piece of information. And so in this particular case, it's going to be the ID, and this is still going to be exactly the same, so we can just copy that logic there. And so now that we've got that working, we have to pass a second argument in this particular case. That's just going to say merge is equal to true, and that's just going to update or append a new item onto that document. And so now we can remove this logic here, just like that. We should still redirect them to that ID, but now it's been written. And instead what we can do is when they get a particular file, we can now check out the data for reading. And so we can do that just like this. And so now what we can do is, surely that will resize for us, resize that. Get a document, we can just paste the same logic in here. And so we will have no longer this line, but instead const poll ref is equal to db.collection, and in this case it's going to be polls.doc, and that is also going to be polls. And then we say const, we could just say data is equal to await poll ref.get, and so here we could just console.log the data, and we can see what that returns. And so here we have an issue, and that's just because we have to make sure that this is an asynchronous call. So now our server restarts, and if I just come over to 4, we can see that we do indeed read this information here. We get no information though, and so if we just instead go data dot and call the data method and refresh that, let's see if that gives us something different. And so you can see we get an empty array, and so here we can say const polls is equal to data.data, call that method, and if object.keys polls does not include the ID that we're calling, just here, we want to punish the user, so we're just going to say res.redirect, and we're going to redirect them back home. Or even better, yeah, that's probably fine. And otherwise, we'll have to return that too. Otherwise, what we're going to do is just send the poll data like this. And so now if I refresh that page, it doesn't work because nothing exists, but we are now live with Firebase, and so we should be able to enter a question to say, what is your favorite color? Question mark. Option 1, Henry, James, let's just say blue. And so if I poll this, let's just see if our Firebase worked. So we can see that we did indeed get an ID, and we get the question and the options and the ID. And so in this particular case, it just gave us a random ID. And that's because we are still reading IDs from here. So we're going to have to copy this logic just here up to this IDs file, read from Firebase, and so this is just going to be polls, so that will send back all of the IDs, so that's pretty straightforward. But in any case, that's fine in this instance, and now what we have to do is we are no longer going to be reading from that file. Once again, we have to add that await syntax, async. And so that fixes that error. And the other thing we have to be conscious of is that this is still fine. This sends the correct thing. The vote is incorrect, so we'll have to resolve that in just a moment. And that's actually working. We can see that it's fine, except now what's happening is it's adding this data. So what we actually want to do is just spread polls. So if I refresh this page, 27 is now how it should be, but for whatever reason our content didn't load. So let's just go and investigate that real quick. So on load, if we just console.log data, let's see what we get back. So we're console.logging cannot read properties of undefined reading options. And that's because options is data.options, which doesn't actually exist. So even better, what we're going to have to do is send this as polls ID. So now our server restarts and we cannot get, that seems odd. Let's console.log data. Data is just coming in, so data is line 139, 155. So exactly, so we're still going to have to actually keep this as data. And what it equates to is the polls.id. So now we refresh the page and it all loads. So that's absolutely perfect. Once again, the last thing we're going to have to just do is change this vote. And so in here, once again, we're going to have to get all of this information here. So this is going to be a combination of everything. We're going to have to read it all. So in here, what I'm going to do is just say, replace all that. And so in this particular case, I'm going to call this one polls and this one data, because data is already going to want to upgrade. And so it's going to take the data for that ID options and add 1. And so now what we can do is just use the same writing logic up here and just say const await.set, copy this whole thing and swap out that line. And so that should set this ID. Well, actually, even better, what we can just do is set data, just like that. We can spread data. And that should overwrite our whole document. And once again, we're just going to have to add the asynchronous call just here. Refresh that, and that is now working. So if I refresh this page, it's going to pull this. And now we can see that blue is the only one. Here it looks like we have an issue with people click. What could be going on? So we had an issue with vote. Data. Data doesn't exist. That's exactly right. So that's going to be polls. So we can refresh this. It loads the correct page. We click blue. We still get an issue with polls. So that is voting correctly. Vote blue. Server.js line 69. Let's just try that once more. And so now we're getting an issue because we haven't set the document ref, and that makes a lot of sense. And so what we have to do is also just copy this docref line and add that in just up here so that we can actually set that document ref. Cool, and so if we refresh that page once more and click Henry, we can see that that vote goes through. And now if we come into our polls, we can see that Henry does in fact have 1 vote. And now if we select blue, blue now has 1 vote, so that works well. And I think the last thing that happened just there is we can remove this line. We will have set this length here. Okay, so if max number of votes is not 0, which is this particular case, so if the option is equal to the option, if the option is equal to 0, then set it to 5%. So we just have something to iron out in here. Okay, so let's think about this. We can remove that line. And so since we set the max width on these particular things, what we can actually do is just remove a lot of this logic. And so now we can, I think we can actually remove that from most of them, to be fair. And so that's going to add the 1. And then if it is equal to 0, it sets that particular option to width. And so once again, we can just come in here and remove that because we set that max width. So let's just try that once more. So now we have Henry. And so if we check, Henry and blue should now be on even terms. Let's think about it. So if we go James, so James is on 1, blue is on 1, and Henry is on 2. And so that's exactly what we've got. So that's cool. So now if we go James 2, so James and Henry are both on 2. And so that's actually working perfectly. And so now we can make another poll. Was this tutorial awesome? Yes. Yes. Double yes. We'll poll that. We get redirected to our page. We can see that we now have a new poll showing up, options yes and double yes. And so what we can do now is just click double yes. And here I think the mistake that we made is that we just need to set this to 0. So if we just change this to 0%, because the maximum number of votes is 0, so therefore only our option should have with. So let's just try this once more. Was this tutorial double yes? So that's working. Last question, final check. Is it working? Yes, no. It's obviously working, yes, and it's perfect, absolutely perfect. And so just like that, you have a working full stack application, data persistence and everything. It's super easy to host on Heroku. You can just deploy it straight from your GitHub, and this will all be live. If you've enjoyed the tutorial, please like and subscribe. It super helps the channel. I'll be coming out with lots of cool content like this. Leave us some feedback. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace.